Line. We've been going through the gospel according to, and I want to say Luke so much because, we spend a little bit of time occasionally in Luke here, and you are at deep water, and we get the name out of, Luke 5:4, Jesus and his disciples out into deep water, and because of that, I don't know, we just we've always been in Luke, but we're in Mark, so mark that in your memory. But if you were here last week, you realize we took a little detour. So we started off at the beginning in the book of Mark, but really we skipped the cool journey of getting to where we are, so we're skipping ahead to Mark chapter 14. And so last week we began what in my mind I've been calling the Easter detour, because we're going to get back to the rest of Mark, but we really want to look at chronologically what's happening around Easter, because you may not realize it, maybe you do, there's a holiday coming up. Anyone know what holiday it is? April Fool's Day, yes. But specifically, the one we're concerned about is Easter. And I think it is funny, though. Easter goes along well with April Fools, because Jesus is going to be like, you thought I was dead, now I'm back. Ha, April Fools. But he said he was coming back. Anyway, so we've been this is like a little more somber in a sense, because in preparing for Easter, we're looking at some stories that are difficult. And this week we're going to look at one that's about betrayal. And so join me as we go there. We're gonna little spoiler alert. We're going to talk about, we know the end of the story, so we can be a little happier even in the midst of some bad stuff. So we're going here in Mark chapter 14. We're going to start. We're going to jump around just a little bit today. We've been here, but we want to jump back, because last week we talked about the Last Supper, which is where we get communion. It was this celebration of the Passover. So I want to jump back, and then we're going to jump back forward, but hopefully you'll follow along. So Mark chapter 14, starting verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the leading priests to arrange to betray Jesus to them. Not a good start, right? Like they were delighted when they heard why he had come, and they promised to give him money. So he began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus. And it's interesting. Like most of you know, I like scholarly stuff, and so I read lots of really thick, musty books. For me, an ideal day is spent, sitting in a library. What's funny, because on the one hand, I love people, and I love getting coffee, and I love hanging out, but I also love sitting in a library, reading dusty old books. And some of you like that library smell with the old books, like a few of you. Most of you are like, oh gosh, why would you want to be in a library with a smell? But scholars sort of try to figure out, there's lots of different theories on why Judas betrays, and is he disillusioned with Jesus? Jesus started off being this Messiah that he was looking for. He's following. Remember, Judas is a follower of Jesus. He's not just some random dude who steps into the picture, betrays him. He's hanging out with him. He's living with him for 3 years. And so, or maybe some people kind of they don't like that, so they go, oh, well, maybe he was trying to get things moving on the Messiah front. If he did this, it would trigger some events, and Jesus would, show up as the Messiah and take over. And a lot of us think, hey, it was greed, because if you read some of the other Gospels, he stole from the treasury. So, money is a funny thing. Money is, on the one hand, it's not important, but then we'll do so many things for it, right? And so it's like, so is it greed? That's like a discussion question for later. We'll talk about that. But Mark, then skipping down to 27, says this. On the way, and this was after communion, after the Passover, and they'd gone and they sang a hymn. They'd kind of done all that stuff. It says on the way, Jesus told them, all of you will desert me, for the scriptures say God will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And so, he's saying, hey, you're all going to abandon me at some point. And this is a quote out of Zechariah. You remember a couple years ago, some of you were with us, we did the Minor Prophet series, and they're not minor prophets because they played Minecraft. They're not minor prophets because they're not important, but they were these shorter prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and there was all these prophecies again of the Messiah to come. And I think sometimes the natural inclination for most of us is to think Jesus is this new thing. Like you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and you're like, what was God doing there? And then you kind of come to the New Testament, and you're like, oh, God decided something new. But it's really not. If you look at the story, all the scriptures speak of Jesus, the Messiah, to come. So sometimes we get a misunderstanding of it. Sometimes we misunderstand what God was doing in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but God was always bringing around this plan. And so we see constantly these scriptures being quoted in the New Testament to go, hey, Jesus is here, he's the Messiah, and he's fulfilling these things. And so this whole plan is coming about through history. It says in verse 28, but after I am raised from the dead, I will go ahead of you to Galilee and meet you there. And so Jesus is constantly telling the plan, but the disciples don't get it. And some of you are like, that's crazy. But then others of you are like, yeah, I know, because I tell my kids to clean their room. And it's like they never heard me. You mentioned once you're going out for ice cream. They remember that. Wait, you said ice cream. But like when the kids are little, like you clean your room, clean your room. And they're like, no, I never heard that. When did you tell me to clean my room? Like 50 bazillion times. And that's it. Jesus is constantly telling them, hey, clean your room. Well, he's not telling them to clean your room. He's saying, hey, I'm going to be crucified. And so I like this. It says, Peter said to him, even if everyone else deserts you, I never will. Peter's kind of that rash. He kind of says what he's thinking. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, Peter, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. Like, you're not just going to deny that I am who I am. You're even going to say you don't know me. And no, Peter declared emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And all the others vowed the same. And so you picture all the disciples are saying, hey, we're not going to deny. So sliding ahead. And this is after, excuse me. This is after he's been in the garden. He was praying. Remember the disciples? They can't stay up. He's got Peter with him and some other disciples, and they're constantly like falling asleep because they had a big Passover meal. I mean, some of you know what it's like. After Thanksgiving, you keep falling asleep. So it's late at night. There's been a big thing. He's got him in this garden praying. He keeps asking him to pray. You can kind of watch last week's if you want to kind of look at that. And so, Jesus is saying, hey, and we left off last week at verse 42. Let's be going. Look, my betrayer is here. And so starting in verse 43, it says, and immediately, even as Jesus said this, Judas, one of the 12 disciples, arrived with a crowd of men armed with swords and clubs. They had been sent by the leading priests, teachers of the religious law, and the elders. And these were, the leading priests, the teachers of the law, the elders. These are, the really connected religious people. These are the guys who sort of had it together. They'd been to the right schools. Religious people always have hats. I don't know why. They probably had great hats, and and then they show up with armed people. Now, I think a lot of us picture Roman guards here, right? It's probably not. It probably would have been the temple police. They didn't just have the Romans at their disposal. Remember, the Jewish people are kind of a kingdom, but they have to, they're under Roman rule, so they get to rule some of their own religious affairs, but they have the Romans, so it's like there's these guards here. And so, it says in verse 44, the traitor, Judas, that's not a good nickname. If you're going to have a nickname, the traitor Judas had given them a prearranged signal. You will know which one to arrest when I greet him with a kiss. Then you can take him away under guard. And as soon as they arrived, Judas walks up to Jesus. Rabbi, he exclaimed, and gave him a kiss. Now that would be like a normal way to greet a friend. We don't do that here. Maybe occasionally somebody will kiss me and go, welcome, and I'm like, oh, that's weird. We might do a hug. I remember I once said to somebody, we're not going to start the greet each other with a holy kiss thing because it is in the Bible. But then people thought I was downplaying that. It is flu season. We don't want a lot of kisses. But it culturally that's how. And if you're like French or something, if you ever been in Europe, like mwah, mwah, like. I guess if you do that, we'll be okay with it, but it'd be weird because it's not a big part of our culture. This would be like a normal way to greet him, and it was probably dim light, so maybe this is the way he goes, hey, don't worry, I got the right guy because I know which one this is, and The interesting thing is Jesus doesn't run away or try to avoid him. He just, he's there. And it says, and think about that for a moment, because I think if you've read this story before, if you've heard this story, you can kind of gloss over this, right? Because you've heard it before. But this is betrayal. And I think sometimes we can kind of take the emotion out of it because we haven't, been there. We've read it so many times. Think about in your life someone betraying you. Most of us, unless you've led this awesome life, most of us have felt betrayal, right? Often someone very close to us. Often a family member, a spouse. It's somebody who like maybe a coworker, somebody you thought you were close with, and you find out they've been trying to get you fired the whole time, or maybe kind of think of that emotion here. That's that moment. This is betrayal. He betrays Jesus over, and I was trying to think of analogies for this, and I was thinking yesterday we were, I don't like heights. Some of you know. But I did get up on the roof yesterday somewhat, and I never got off the ladder. I was near the roof. I was walking on the fire escape railings for a little bit, trying to get into the gutters and clean them out and everything. Unfortunately, David was here helping me. And so David was up on the ladder, and I was thinking betrayal would be, my job yesterday was to hold the bottom of the ladder, which I think is the better job. Some of you who share my fear of heights get it. And I was thinking betrayal would be David trusting me to hold the ladder and me just yanking it out. So to test that theory yesterday, no, I did not. But it's that kind of thing where someone who you've entrusted betrays you. And Jesus knew it was coming. It'd be like David knowing that I was going to yank the ladder and go and climbing up the ladder anyway. That would be, you got to have a lot of reason. And so Jesus knows he's going to be betrayed. But again, this is part of the plan. This is how he makes the way for us to go back to know the Father. This is all part of that plan. And so he allows himself to be betrayed. And so it says in verse 46, then the others grabbed Jesus and arrested him. But one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. One of them. This is where it's fun to, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the same story, but they don't tell all the same stories. They tell different perspectives, because if four of us saw an event, we would all kind of tell like a little bit different. We would emphasize different details that interest us. The cool thing is John writes later, and John kind of tells us some extra details. I like this one. He tells us it was Peter. So rash, Peter whips out a sword. You probably didn't think, because I don't know what you picture when you picture the disciples. We tend to picture them like kind and gentle, right? Like I was at Tractor Supply yesterday. I mean, I'm officially a Southern Delawarean when you go to Tractor Supply on a Saturday. Can you hear me? Can you feel me? And we walked in, and you could hear like the chirping and it's like the time of year where they have the little chickens and the little baby ducks, and it's like you can go, buy little chickens and little ducks. And anyone have chickens at home? Like that's you're like in suburbia in Southern Delaware when people have chicken. No one wants to admit it here. I was going to try to get some fresh eggs later. But you kind of picture, I think I picture the disciples as being the kind of people who come and pet baby ducks, or maybe, like they're gentle. They're like out petting lambs or something. You're probably not thinking the disciples are packing. And that's really what it is. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, where did you come up with that sword? He's like, put it away. And so he chops off the ear. We find out in one of the other Gospels that it's this guy named Malchus. And so he just chops off his ear, which is not, again, how you probably picture disciples. And, of course, Jesus heals them. So that's kind of cool. It says, verse 48, Jesus asked them, am I some dangerous revolutionary that you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there among you teaching every day, but these are happening to fulfill what the scriptures say about me. Jesus is like, hey, am I gangsta? I was... No, I was out in the temple area preaching. Apparently this side thinks that really funny. This side doesn't think it's funny. This is in the middle, some gangsta Jesus. So anyway, but he's saying, hey, was I a serial killer you couldn't find? No, I was out there. You could have arrested me, but you're doing this in secret. You're doing this at night. And then it's interesting, verse 50, all of his disciples deserted him and ran away. Why? Because they were scared. Because there's dudes with swords. Peter just chopped a guy's ear off. There's all this going on. And then verse 51, which I think is one of the weirdest verses in this whole thing. One young man followed behind him, was clothed in only a long linen shirt. When the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. Did not think that verse was in the Bible, did you? And really, this is one of those facts you kind of go, okay, why are they including this? It's just like one of those trivial facts of things that happen. But I think, it is a funny sort of historical fact to us. But in that culture, nakedness was like a big shame thing. You wouldn't go running around naked. And so basically this guy was, rather than get caught with Jesus, he was willing to run around naked. And so I'm sure he ran off, found some clothes, but he'd rather be shamed than caught with Jesus. So Jesus is completely abandoned at this moment. It says in verse 53, they took Jesus to the high priest's home where the leading priests, elders, and the teachers of religious law had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and went right into the high priest's courtyard. There he sat with the guards, warming himself by the fire. And, we think this is kind of weird, going to the courtyard, but a lot of times courtyards were open in a way that you could kind of come and go. And so there are guards there. Peter's just kind of hanging out. Hey, guys, how you doing? Warming himself. And so Peter's the only one sort of sticking around. And you kind of wonder, what's he doing? I mean, just slashed the ear, but now he's kind of, I picture like one of those movies where, you're sneaking around like a spy movie and you're doing something you're not supposed to do. So Peter's he's snuck into he's just hanging out there, kind of taking the risk of getting recognized. It says, verse 55, inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they couldn't find any. And if you've read any commentaries on this is sort of an illegal trial. Now, we don't know exactly, but the surviving evidence of the Mishnah, and if you want to get into technical stuff, there was, it's a little bit shady that it's at night. It's on the eve of a holiday, and so there's a little bit of hey, you're trying to, kind of sneak this in, and now they couldn't give the death penalty. Again, remember, the Jewish people are under Rome. So they had a lot of authority on things, but they couldn't just, willy-nilly go killing people. Willy-willy, no killy. And so they, if it helps you remember things. And so they have, Jesus is there, and, they're trying to figure out some things. And so it says, and we think of, generally in America, when we arrest someone, generally you're supposed to have some evidence first, right? That's how we think of things. You have to have evidence, and then you arrest people. They kind of arrest him, and now they're looking for the evidence. Now they're looking for the justification. Now they're trying to find things. It says, many false witnesses spoke against him, but they contradicted each other. And I picture that, you ever have kids trying to lie to you? And one of two things happens. Either their stories are too perfect and they're the same, you've rehearsed this. Every detail is exactly the same. You don't share anything different. That's a little suspicious. Or, you kind of separate the kids and they can't remember all the different pieces and their stories are so different. Parents are all going, yeah, that's happened. And that's kind of, they can't nail down something that they're like, this is what Jesus did. And so it says, finally, some men stood up and gave this false testimony. They said, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without human hands. But even then, they didn't get their story straight. So then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus was silent and made no reply. Then the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Direct question. Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. And that makes the priest very unhappy. Because he's saying two things. One, Son of Man. This is the messianic title. He's saying, hey, you guys are looking for the Messiah. You're a part of this Sanhedrin, this council. You kind of trace it back to, there were 70 people, actually 71 at the time, on this council. And there's this, you're important and you're these religious leaders. You guys are kind of the descendants of Moses in that way. And you guys are waiting for this Messiah. Hey, I am that one and you've missed it. And he's going to sit at God's right hand, which to us is like an obscure, like, what does that even mean? But he's saying, hey, I'm gonna have real authority, and eventually I'm gonna judge you. And then it goes into 65. It says, then some of them began to spit at him. Well, actually, I skipped 63. Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, why do we need any other witnesses? You have heard all this blasphemy. What is your verdict? Guilty, they all cried. He deserves to die. Now, we don't think, most of you, honestly, who here has gotten upset in the last week? Okay, a couple of you. You never have probably been in traffic, someone cut you off, you're like, and you tore your clothes, right? That would be weird. But that was their cultural way of saying, they were in such great grief. And so I picture Hulk Hogan because I'm from the 80s, but that kind of thing. They kind of tear their clothes and it's a sign of grief and they're like, guilty. And then, which is funny because he's only guilty if it's not true. And it is true. But so, and then it says, then some of them began to spit at him, and they blindfolded him and beat him with their fists. Prophesy to us, they jeered, and the guards slapped him as they took him away. And so they're mocking him. Kind of like, hey, so you're a prophet? Who hit you? And so they're mocking Jesus. They take him away. It says, meanwhile, Peter was in the courtyard below. And so Peter's kind of outside of things, and it says, one of the servant girls who worked there for the high priest, she was either very young or low status from the words used there for her. And it says, and they noticed Peter warming himself at the fire. She looked at him closely and said, you were one of those with Jesus of Nazareth. It's kind of like being recognized when you don't want to be. Like, you ever go to Walmart and you just went out to get something, and maybe you're not dressed as best as you want to be, or so you're in the people of Walmart video kind of thing. And I picture it that it's like not quite the same, but he doesn't want to be recognized. He wants to be there. He's trying to figure things out, but now he's kind of like caught. And a few days ago, he probably would have been like, oh yeah, I'm with Jesus. But now he's like, no. Peter denied it. He says, I don't know what you're talking about, he said. He went out to the entryway. Just then a rooster crowed. It says, verse 69, when the servant girl saw him standing there, she began telling the others, this man is definitely one of them. But Peter denied it again. A little later, one of the other bystanders confronted Peter and said, you must be one of them because you're Galilean. And the Galileans sort of have an accent. They were like, it'd be like saying you're from southern Delaware. We say words like wooder. Anyone say wooder instead of water? A couple of you, you know what I mean? So they're kind of going, hey, you're not from here. You're not from the big city. We can hear your accent. And Peter swore, a curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know this man you're talking about. And immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Suddenly Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And he broke down and wept. He knew he'd failed Jesus. This is really the last scene in the book of Mark that we see with Peter. It's kind of left off here. We're just sort of left with, he failed him. And then we'll continue through the story in the next couple of weeks. But, we're sort of left with this, what happens to him. And, you start wondering, why did Peter fail? Do you wonder? I mean, he went from, I will die with you, I will never deny you, to I'm scared of this servant girl in the courtyard. I'm even scared to be recognized that I knew you. And, it's interesting because, and then I start thinking about, Judas and Peter really both betray Jesus in different ways, right? And then you start, it's easy to sort of, because we know what Judas does, it's easy for us to look at Judas and go, well, it was, he was just, horrible. He was never part of them. You kind of picture him like kind of like all the disciples are hanging out and he's like not in the selfie. He's like outside of that, if they're all taking a picture or something. But, he was in there. He was a disciple. He did the things, and he saw Jesus' ministry. They preached the good news. They healed the sick, but then they're kind of left with both betraying Jesus. Now, I looked at baby names, not because we're having one, not that I know of. In 2016, because that's the statistic I could find, there were 1,904 people, kids, actually some girls too, named Peter in America. So that's a lot. Judas, there were 23. You're not generally, if you're choosing baby names, most of you aren't like, I'm going to go with Judas. Because, you hear a joke about, we go into heaven, and who do you hear about? Peter, Peter's, at the gates of heaven. People, you're not like, oh, you're a Judas. Oh, yeah, great. Now, if your name is Judas, I'm sorry. but it's kind of, Peter gets known as something very different than Judas. And even though they both betray Jesus at this moment, Peter, it's interesting, because I was actually reading a book this week. Sometimes I like to read books and things about the Easter story because, again, we get so familiar with it, if you've heard it, that you kind of, you picture the story in your head. You think of the things you think of when you read the scriptures. And so I've been reading this book on this whole week, this last 24 hours of Jesus' life. And I was reading this guy, and he said, why is it in all four Gospels? Why does this story show up? Because, it's probably because Peter tells the story. Peter could have, he was the leader of the early church in a lot of ways. He could have been like, let's scratch that part out, but I think, Peter he's probably telling the story of his failure because it emphasizes, it underscores the fact that there's so much grace in Christ. Peter screws up, and then it's interesting because I know I've been trying to stay in Mark when I'm talking about Mark. Some of the details and things in the other story, I like to look at those. But I want to jump to John here, and because I want to tell you the rest of the story with Peter. And so Peter, it says, this is after the resurrection. Spoiler alert: we have Easter. We can celebrate because Jesus comes back to life. We can have new life in Him. Would love to tell you more about that. We're gonna have a big celebration at church in a couple of weeks ago. We call that Easter, and that's a big deal. But this is kind of after that happens. It says Jesus. In John chapter 21, I'm going to tell the story more than I am going to read all of it. It says, later Jesus appeared again to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and, several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and the other disciples. And then Peter just says, hey, I'm going fishing. And why was Peter going fishing? Because he's a fisherman. This was not a trick question. this is what he did. And so that they're they're still trying to figure out this Jesus thing. Like, he was dead, now he's back. What does that mean for us? And so they're out there, and they go out fishing. And the other disciples say, hey, we'll go with them too. And then at dawn, Jesus comes up on the beach, and he's like, hey, did you guys catch any fish? And they're like, no. And when you do that, you hate that. Like, if you've been fishing for a while and people are like, you catch anything? You're like, no, I didn't catch anything. And so he's like, hey, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat and you'll get some. And they did, and then they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish. And then the disciple Jesus loved, who is John, because John writes this, and he always makes sure, he kind of calls himself that. He says, the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard this, he put on his tunic. It's kind of funny. He'd taken off his outer garment because they're fishing. He throws it back on, and he jumps in the water. I'm thinking, I would just leave it on the boat, get it later, but he puts his clothes back on, he jumps in the water. You kind of picture Peter always doing crazy things. This is it. And so, he swims in. It's 100 yards, so he can do a good 100-yard, crawl. He gets there, and they get there. Jesus is on the beach cooking fish. I always wonder, where did he get the fish? Did he bring his own fish? Did he make fish? Whether, I don't know. And so they're sitting there, and there's this famous interchange. It says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep." Third time he asked Simon, son of John, "Do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked the question. Third time he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." And see, here's my theory, and some other people go along with this, is Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus restores him 3 times. And it's not that, 3 gets used a lot of things in biblical, there's some, you can kind of guess on some numerology stuff and everything. But the point is, we sin, we go the wrong way, we do the wrong thing, God forgives. And so Peter is left, out of things in a sense, because he betrayed Jesus. And Jesus comes to him and assures him, hey, you're still going to be a part of this. And if you open up the book of Acts, which is out after the Gospels, Peter's preaching, 3,000 people are coming to know Jesus. And so God doesn't just throw us out when we screw things up. Peter betrays Jesus at the moment that he's needed most. Peter didn't deserve grace, but neither do we. A guy I follow on Twitter said this. Tim Keller said, "God relentlessly offers his grace to people who do not deserve it, seek it, or appreciate it after they've been saved by it." We're offered grace not because we're good, not because we've got it together, not because, we're just great religious people. We're offered grace because that's who Jesus is. Jesus goes to the, cross, kind of the spoiler alert for this what we're studying this season. He goes to the cross so that we can have new life, not because we're good enough, but because we're not. Not because, we're so great, but because his love is so great for us. And here's the thing that I like about Tim Keller's quote again. God relentlessly offers his grace to people who do not deserve it, seek it, or appreciate it after they've been saved by it. We say this a lot. We're all a little jacked up. And if you don't think you're a little jacked up, you're probably really jacked up. Because, we don't always do a great job of living this out. Right? There's this book, and I've gotten closer to reading it. I've read the table of contents. Eventually, I'm going to read the whole book, but I love the title, and it's "The Christian Atheist," because it sounds like an oxymoron, right? You're like a Christian atheist, but the sort of the reason that this guy writes this book is sometimes we say we believe in God, but then we live in a very different way, right? So we've got good theology, not very good liveology. I know that's not really a word, but I look through it this way, and I think of 2 things in our culture: sex and money are 2 of the big things. Like whenever we're watching TV as a family, which is hard to find a show that you can tolerate, but I find myself constantly going, "Not our values," which is our short term for, these are not our values. Because especially when it comes around things like sexuality. When I watch TV, I have a very different picture of what sexuality is supposed to be than the picture I get in the Bible. And then I think in America, the other big one is money, because we love our money in America. If you don't think you love money, go outside of America. Go to a third world country where people don't have anything and are much happier than we are. And then you come back here, you're like, why do I have so much and I'm so unhappy? Now, it's not a bad thing to make money. It's not a bad thing for God to give you a gift to have money. But the problem is often, we don't have money, money has us. We become this slave to it. And so, if God blesses you to make money, go make money. But give generously. And so there's this, this love of money we sometimes we betray because these are some of the titles from the chapters. Is when you believe in God but won't forgive. That's another huge one, isn't it? You're supposed to, forgive or you're not forgiven. We talk about that once in a while. Forgiven people forgive. That's hard because sometimes we don't want to forget. We want forgiveness, but we don't want to forgive. When you believe in God, but pursue happiness at any cost. We all want to be happy. Don't get me wrong, but we should pursue Christ at any cost. There's a joy that comes in life, even when things are tough. It as well. We sang that earlier. If you've read the story of the song, basically his whole family dies. But he can still, like when he's crossing the Atlantic in the same spot, they died on the shipwreck. He's like, hey, it is well with my soul. That's hard to say. But when you're pursuing Christ at all costs, you can. When you believe in God but trust more in money. That's a hard one in America. I'm not trying to hit that because we're trying to get the offering next. I'm just saying, sometimes it's hard because we like our money. We like the things. We like the comforts it can buy. Again, money is not evil, but the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Because we tend to make good things into God things that God created to be good, to be something to be enjoyed, and we make it a God in our life. We make it the number one thing that we pursue. And so oftentimes we don't, do it. And then there's this really kind of, there's two different sort of trajectories because Judas ends up, I always like to say, roadkill pinata. Because if you read the different stories, have you ever seen roadkill on the road? I remember driving out as a kid, Michigan. I was driving across Michigan, and like the animals that die on the side of the road. Sorry, you animal lovers, plug your ears for a second. They actually get warm and they explode. And I actually saw some explode. It was crazy. I'd never seen such a thing. It's still in my memory. When I was 14, so that was like 5-6 years ago. But the scriptures tell not two different stories, but you hear two different aspects of what happens to Judas. He's so distraught, he hangs himself. And then it says he burst and his guts spread all over the field. And so, you're like, I didn't know that was in there. That's in the book of Acts, man. Read it. So I picture him as roadkill pinata. He probably hung himself and then no one did anything with him. He got hot and anyway. Two very different things. There's this question again. Theologians kind of go, could he have repented? And we'll talk about that. We can sit down in the Bible study and have some good conversation with that. But it's two different trajectories because Peter, he betrays, but he repents. He seeks God's forgiveness. And the cool thing is, here's the thing. All this betrayal, everything that's going on here, Jesus goes into this knowing it, right? He knows that there's going to be betrayal. He knows that he's going to be betrayed. This isn't like take him by surprise, like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. He's telling them all along. But Jesus does it because of his great love for us, because he wants to rewrite our story to be one where we're reunited with God. We're connected with him. And we can trust that even though we fail him, he won't fail us. He offers that life, that forgiveness. I think a lot of us sometimes we think, hey, maybe I'm too far gone. You're never too far gone. God takes guys like Peter and builds a kingdom. Not because Peter was awesome, but because God is and his love is. And God wants you to be a part of building his kingdom. Whether you're just starting out in faith or whether you've been there a long time, I encourage you, take that step. Repent like Peter, seek Jesus, and he will change your world. So as the band comes back to play,